Hi, and welcome to the NatWest Markets U.S. Election Watch podcast. I'm Brian Daingerfield, the head of G10 FX Strategy at NatWest Markets in the U.S.
And I'm John Briggs, head of strategy for the Americas.
So, John, the U.S. election is now just days away, but in a lot of ways, election day is already happening, especially when you look at these early voting stats.
Yeah, it's pretty staggering, Brian. I mean, last election, about 130 million people voted. Already, you've got 65 million have voted. I mean, it's a little less than half, 47% of the 26 electorate has already voted. And we've already passed the mail-in and early votes from 2016. So, by all accounts, it looks like not just our early voting and mail-in voting up, but, we thought turnout would be higher in this election. It certainly looks like it's leading that way. I will say, though, as we've discussed many times, and as everyone, all our listeners know, it's not really the national story that makes the difference. Where are we in the swing states? And it's even more impressive in some of these key swing states. In North Carolina, 67% of the 2016 electorate. Again, we expect that to be higher, but using that as a benchmark, 67% have voted. Georgia, 66, Florida, 63. Some really strong turnout and early voting. I mean, of course, part of that is just a lot of these states have opened before others. But still very, very, very high numbers. One last point to make, though, what's interesting is that a couple of these states give you some information on ballots that have been returned or early votes based on party affiliation. And the numbers here are coming back generally favoring the Democrats. I will caution, however, that when you look at this, that if you have Republicans that have polled as more likely to go vote in person, this doesn't mean that the Democrats necessarily ahead, but just that they're as far as mail-in and early voting goes, they're ahead. But if you look at North Carolina, 1.2 million affiliated with the Democratic Party have voted, whereas 950,000 affiliated with the GOP have voted. That leaves still about 30% of people with no affiliation have voted. So that, again, this is not a determinant, but it's just a show of energy. Florida, the GOP actually has an edge 1 million to 670,000 in person. But if you include mail-in ballots, the Democrats have the edge of 2.6 to 2.2. But again, you kind of leaves 20% of the electorate that in Florida that has no affiliation. So there can be a pretty good swing there. So, the Democrats are certainly ahead in early voting. It looks like they have a lead, but it could easily dissipate if Republican energy, is really more focused on in person rather than early voting. So you got to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt.
Yeah, I think I agree there as well. Certainly take this with a grain of salt, because one of the things that we should be considering is, what does the early voting data tell us that polling has not already told us? We've had a very good sense from polling throughout this cycle that Democrats were likely to dominate in mail-in voting in particular, and that appears to be backed up by the numbers. We should also consider the possibility that turnout in the mail-in voting being historically high is cannibalizing the turnout on election day. So, for example, individuals who were not planning on voting on election day, if they're voting by mail this time for the first time, that's new turnout. But it's possible that this is just individuals who would have shown up at the ballots on November 3rd, instead casting their ballots early. And so I think we should be cautious in over-interpreting this as potentially a major positive for Biden and the Democrats. I think instead we should be thinking about it as what it is, which is consistent with what polling has told us, which is that Democrats were likely to dominate, particularly in mail-in voting. But I think it's also a symbol, as you mentioned, John, that this is going to be an election that has a possibility of very high turnout. What do you think the turnout, if this does turn out to be a very strong turnout election, who do you think that favors? How do you think that that influences the race?
Well, I mean, I think our assumption is that does help Biden. And I will say, to your point, I was somebody that always went to vote in person. I voted by mail. Of course, in Connecticut, it doesn't really matter for the national race, but that's a case in point right there. Answering your question on turnout, we do assume this helps Biden because there really hasn't been much evidence Trump has meaningfully expanded his base. I mean, you've made this comment before. Trump has a very strong floor, in approval ratings over 4 years, but he also seems to have a pretty strong ceiling. And the same has come through, on his ratings when for the election cycle, which is favorability, and also, just his percentages that will vote for him versus for Biden, things like that. So, one of Trump's strong suits is his supporters are extremely enthusiastic. He has an extremely high approval rating amongst them, even relative to Biden voters. So, but, without expanding that base, a big increase in turnout compared to 16 is unlikely to capture new Trump supporters because they're already ones that are enthusiastic and already likely to vote.
So the amount of early voting that's happened, really already happened, does seem to reduce the relative importance of some recent events. But John, why don't you run me through some of your thinking on the last debate, stalling of stimulus talks, and some of the more recent developments, even though with all of this early voting, there's fewer votes to capture or fewer minds to change, if you will, by these late events. But what are you thinking about some of these recent developments?
Yeah, I mean, we know that like throughout this whole time that there's been a lot less people that are undecided as versus 2016. So there's a much smaller slice of the population kind of for one candidate to carve off or the other, or that will probably make up their mind in the last week or so. Again, the early voting accentuating that. I did notice some interesting trends in the last couple of days. We're just starting to get some polls back that are post the final debate, which I think Trump did much better at. There's been plenty of articles about if he had acted like that at the first debate, would this been a much closer race? But that's moot. But what's interesting, if you look at some polls in Texas and Pennsylvania, again, they're very, very minor in number. We don't want to overread into this. Let's see how they come out in the next few days. But with Biden's comments on energy and moving away from a carbon-based energy economy and towards cleaner energy, in Texas, we don't have Texas has a huge energy economy, but we assume that's going to go red anyway. Pennsylvania, though, we've seen some polls actually swing to putting in Trump in favor. Now, the polls themselves are not the most well-rated polls, but when you do see the states with high energy economies starting to swing noticeably just post-debate, you wonder if there is something there. I don't know if it's durable. I don't know if it's too late or if it's an outsized thing. But, I do think that Trump benefited from the debate, and we have discussed a lot about how Biden needs to make a mistake in order for Trump to have a better chance at winning the election. Personally, I don't think that's a big enough mistake, but, Pennsylvania's been polling +8, +9, +6, +5, and, pretty in that range pretty steadily. And if we start to see it become a little bit closer here, because you could point back to those comments. My last point I want to make is on fiscal stimulus, which is another recent development, and how that's certainly fallen through, and it looks like there's going to be no chance of getting any near-term fiscal stimulus after the election. I do think that there is the possibility that post-election, if you get a strong Democratic win in the sweep, that you could get near-term stimulus bills in the lame duck. Because one of the reasons why Pelosi didn't want to negotiate small bills or several bills is that if she passes a small bit, then there's going to be no incentive for the Republicans to come back to the table at all. But if they know they're going to control Congress down the road or come January and be able to pretty much pass what they want, now that's too big a statement, but we can come back to that once we see the makeup of the Senate on the prospect for fiscal stimulus. But the idea being that she might be more willing to compromise on a bill right after the election if they know that they're going to have control of government come January. Now, that still leaves it up to whether Donald Trump signs anything, and that's a wild card I'm not ready to predict.
Great. Thanks very much for that, John. That's all the time we have today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the U.S. Election Watch. Please subscribe to get future episodes of this and other NatWest Markets podcasts. And please like the podcast if you enjoyed it. It will help others to find it. We also encourage you to find more of our content on our website and on our social media channels. Thanks very much.
Thank you.